One thing that I've found with taking psychedelic mushrooms is that they are not there for me. They are not there to entertain me, to make me feel good, or for the superficial purposes of getting fucked up. They are sacred teachers, and through every trip they must be respected because they give lessons, not good times. However, I have also found through my experiences that great feelings of love and happiness can come forth. And on the contrary, experiences of absolute fear, insanity and death have also occurred. There is a duality that mushrooms present, whether it be good or bad. There has been one trip so far in my life that's changed me forever, and that has changed all of those who were there forever. It was a yearly camping trip that I engaged in with some of my closest friends. This was the 4th year we had gone, and each year the trip had escalated. By this I mean each year the crazier the experiences became. Not a bad crazy, just a memorable crazy. Each year many different substances are brought, and every year everyone has come out okay, with their mental and physical health still intact. However, this year was different. The trip happened during our last night of camping. It was a Sunday, and it had been raining all day. In the late afternoon, the weather cleared and the sun decided to finally come out. By the time the 3rd day came, no one had the ability to check the time. All phones were dead, no one had a watch, and we were isolated, so time didn't really matter to us anymore. I would guess it was around the late afternoon when the majority of us decided to eat, pardon my French, penis envy. Some had also decided to eat psychedelic truffles, but I stuck with the phallic envy because I was curious and had never taken this particular strain before. The beginning of the trip was extremely beautiful. The 12 of us were all sitting around the campfire. The sun had just begun to set. This created an extremely warm and happy atmosphere. My boyfriend was at the right side of me, and my friend on my left. There were only 2 people in the group who decided to take an 1/8. Everyone else took half. The phallic envy that we had was twice as potent than the normal. This is why most took half. There were a few people in the group that only ate the smallest amount of caps, and in under an hour everyone had blasted off. At first, the 2 people tripping the strongest were me and my friend, who also took a full 1/8. Once I started tripping, I could not speak, but only smile. I listened to the conversations and laughter that were happening all around me. With my eyes closed, I could see everything. I could see everyone sitting around the fire, straight in front of me, even though my eyes were shut. Then my vision would fade between the image of the campfire and everyone talking into a warm peach and yellow hue with white-lined fractals. Beautiful, bright, vivid, extreme fractals. I could hear almost like a woman singing in the far reaches of the back of my mind, very soft, like a mother's voice. Such a strong wave of absolute love and awareness came over me, like the kind of love and happiness I had not experienced since I was a very young child, so genuine, unspoiled and innocent. The best way I can describe the energy that came to me was that of a maternal, protective and loving being. It was the mushrooms speaking to me, teaching me, showing me the absolute beauty and love that is between everything living. Then tears and snot started to drain out of my face. It was the hardest I have ever cried, yet the biggest smile remained on my face. Crying and smiling and laughing, I felt like I had just been reborn. It was the hardest I had ever tripped in my life. The body high was insane. It was like being dead and seeing the light, seeing everything, encased within an absolute and divine love. This was real. What I was experiencing was more real than any other moment in my life that I have ever known. It was more clear than any other sober moment, and I never wanted to leave. I never wanted it to stop. And lucky for me, I was experiencing this in the moment because within the group there was one individual who had found himself in a very, very dark place. I will call him X. So this individual had struggled with many hardships within the past year. There were 2 members of the group that were a couple. The girl was a previous partner to X, but it had happened years ago and everyone was friendly and had moved on. One thing I'd like to mention, shortly after my experience around the campfire, is that I needed to use the restroom, and it took all of my will to get out of that chair. As I got up and walked away to find a place to pee, walking was extremely fluid, as if I was floating. There was a disconnect between me and my physical body. I couldn't feel my body, but I could see that my arms and legs were actually moving, and my body was a part of everything, blending into all of the objects around me. The background and my limbs became the same thing. As I was walking, I was looking down at my feet and at the stones and dirt that I was walking over. And when I was a good distance away from the camp, I finally looked up. All around me, in the brush, on the moss beds, on the fallen trees, there were people. At least, I thought there were people. I sat behind a boulder by myself and intentionally looked to my left, and there was a young guy around my age just huddled over next to me. I could not see his face, he was just there, frozen, not moving or breathing. I remember him so clearly. Tan shorts, a green shirt, reddish brown short hair, and blue tennis shoes, just huddled over. This did not frighten me. I knew that this boy was not really there. None of these people were. At least not in the physical pain of existence. All these people were huddled like this boy, all facing different directions. I could see no faces. Everyone just sat there with their heads buried in their arms all around the forest. I knew that I was seeing spirits. It felt like I had died and entered somewhere far away. I wasn't scared. All I could feel was intense love for all of these people. And once I couldn't see them anymore, I went back to the fire. And back to X. As I returned, only 4 of us had remained at the fire. The others were in their tents, so it was just me, my boyfriend, the girl that I said used to be with X, and X himself. All 4 of us were tripping extremely hard at this point. This is where things took a rather dark turn. And as I was there experiencing such bliss, there was a member of the group who had been taken over by extreme fear and darkness, and it then began to project and propagate onto everyone else. X looked to the girl and asked her and 2 other male members of the group would be down to have sex. We all looked at X with an extremely confused look on our face, like, where did that come from? The girl just looked at X and said, no thanks. X then said, wow, I'm very offended right now. Come on, it would be fun. We all just stared at him and thought, what the fuck just happened? Granted, the girl's current boyfriend was there in a tent only just a few feet away, and X was very serious. This is the point where my boyfriend and I looked at each other like, oh no, he's gone. The thing with X is that he has suffered enough through schizophrenic tendencies and episodes of duality personality disorder, and members of his biological family have suffered through mental illness. He had been fine so far over the weekend, but no one should have let him take those mushrooms. So X got up and left the fire. After that, everything was relatively okay for maybe an hour. And throughout this hour, however, X started to say very strange things. The group was back together at the fire. X then continued to say out of nowhere, I didn't get to come. We were all like, what? He then said, I'm not down. I need to go home. I'm just not feeling it. We were there 3 hours away from home, an hour away from the nearest city, and everyone was too intoxicated to drive, but X was insistent that he went home. So my boyfriend went up to him and said, no, we can't go home right now. It's not possible. Everyone is too fucked up and no one can drive. And there was no way in hell we were going to let him take someone's keys so that he could drive. He was obviously too far gone on the mushrooms. and at this point the tension in the air was greatly intensified. My good blissful trip had now been infested with complete fear. I was so scared. The situation was far too hard for me to deal with at the time, but X was extremely insistent. He then began to obsessively ask where the girl was, his ex. She had gone to her tent with her boyfriend to go lay down at this point. He also kept insisting for the keys. He kept repeating himself over and over, and everyone began to fear the situation. My boyfriend just grabbed him and hugged him and said, "I love you so much, man. Everything is okay. Come sit with me, please." He was saying everything he could to try and calm him down, and as my boyfriend was hugging him and saying this, X began to lick and kiss his neck very intensely. X then continued to say, "No, I'm not down." This continued and repeated for what seemed to be at least an hour, which really only ended up being around 20 minutes. So we convinced X to try and lie down and relax. He agreed, and he lay down outside of a tent. After half an hour of him being silent on the ground with his eyes wide open, he silently got up and sat next to the girl who at this point had come out of her tent. No one even noticed him at first. And then suddenly, without anyone expecting it, X jumped onto the girl and pinned her to the ground and tried to kiss her. Her boyfriend and mine both shot up and grabbed him off her. Everyone was still tripping intensely hard. The situation was so extremely frightening and intense, no one knew what to do or how to handle it. My boyfriend ripped him from her, and as he did so, X screamed louder and more intensely than I have ever witnessed before. I shot up from my chair and ran to the dark corner of the camp. I was trembling, almost throwing up from the horror. X was shouting "no, no, no," as if somebody was peeling off his skin. There was so much pain and fear in his voice. The girl scrambled and just stared at X. She was sobbing, and X continued to scream, "I love you, I love you, I love you. Why do you have to be with him? I just want to make the pain stop. I just want it to end." I couldn't even bear to look at him. I just stared at the ground and trembled. There were only 2 girls there, and one of them had just been assaulted. I felt like we all had entered hell, that we had all crossed over into the spirit world, and that ghosts and demons were stalking us outside our camp and controlling what was going on. I was having severe auditory hallucinations, voices screaming loud, cracking, and noises coming from the dark forest that just trapped us. It took every bit of my strength not to lose it. Her boyfriend looked at her across from the fire and asked if she was okay. My boyfriend told them to leave and go somewhere safe, and as they left, X continued to scream and fight back, the most horrible scream. I can still hear it so clearly. And on top of the screaming was the wailing from the poor girl who had just been assaulted, crying, screaming. All of the energy was so intensified. A few members of the group were sober or had only drank alcohol, yet were still crying and fearful like the rest of us. They even admitted that they had begun tripping themselves, even though they had never taken psychedelics. The energy that engulfed us was that strong. Then, just as sudden as it had started, X said, "Can we just relax? I just want to be happy. Can I sit by the fire with you guys?" As if none of that had ever happened. And just like that, he was a different person. And for this, my fear of him intensified. He sat by the fire. I shook in my chair and mustered up the courage to look at his face. His eyes were black. His entire pupil was dilated so far that no more colours could be seen in his eyes. There was also a second set of eyes looking out beneath his. Everyone's face was normal except his. 4 eyes on his face, just looking back to me. I knew something had crept inside him and changed him. He then began to say, "I think I just had a really bad trip. I just really want to know what it's like to die. Where is she? Where is she?" Everyone shook in their seats. All we could do at this point was talk him through it, tell him everything he wanted to hear, and to stay as calm as possible. He would reach out to the embers of the fire and try to burn himself, and again, my boyfriend had to restrain him. At this point, I was so terrified I had to go back to the car, and I locked myself inside it. My boyfriend and I got up and left. We didn't have a flashlight, only a lighter, so he held the lighter out on the trail and led the way. There was a point where we were walking and both of us were in complete darkness. We couldn't even see the fire anymore. The lighter only lit around 2 or 3 feet of space in front of us. I then began to panic because I couldn't see the road or the fire, and the car was only supposed to be no more than 20 yards from the fire. It felt like we were never going to get there, and that we would be walking in darkness forever. So we had to find a way in the complete darkness. I looked up at the stars, and the light was so blue and intense. The stars were rotating, shifting, and shooting across the sky extremely fast. And at this point I knew for sure I had travelled to a different dimension, because nothing was making sense anymore, yet the stars were still so beautiful. I then began to remember the loving force that seemed to protect me earlier. I knew I was going to get through this night no matter how long it seemed, because that force still enveloped me. We locked ourselves inside the car and wrapped up in sleeping bags. My brain was too hyperactive to sleep. My boyfriend had taken less mushrooms and wasn't as stimulated, so he began to fall asleep, leaving me alone in the darkness of the car, until light shined through the next morning. I sat in the car, terrified for my life, until the sun came. There were too many things that I had experienced inside the car to really document or tell you, and morning was such a relief to me. But I was still tripping well into midday, but it was a very light trip, almost like a heightened awareness. My boyfriend and I packed up and left. I couldn't bear to go back to the camp and even look at his face. There was such a darkness inside of him, it shook me so bad that even today I still struggle with it. It was the epitome of fear and evil. Mental illness creates such a sad and terrifying pit inside people who suffer from it. In conclusion, I've never experienced such fear and insanity in my entire life. To see a person so broken down and so far gone was extremely terrifying and existential. X had woken up the next morning and remembered nothing. This frightened us because it made it obvious that it was his dual personality that had taken over. To see a schizophrenic have a bad trip on mushrooms was indescribably traumatic. I had both the worst and the best trip of my life that night. I stand true to the fact that the mushrooms are teachers and are there to provide a heightened awareness of either the fear or the love that exists all around us. I chose to embrace love and not fear last night, and it was that got me through it. The days following, I had severe nausea, anxiety and discomfort. My body was still feeling the effects of the experience, and this will stick with me for the rest of my life.